Good evening, everybody. I'm Stesha Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager here at the Seattle Public Library. As we begin tonight, I want to take a minute to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land. Here in Seattle, these are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past, present, and future, and thank them for their stewardship of the land. Welcome to tonight's program with Rebecca Nagle and Wudan Yan, presented with Elliott Bay Book Company. I have a couple quick announcements before we get started. First, I'd like to take a minute to thank the folks who make tonight's program possible, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation and the Seattle Times for their generous support of library programs. And thank you as well to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs that touch the lives of everyone in our community. So if folks here tonight are Library Foundation donors, thank you so much for your support. I also wanted to mention that we have assistive listening technology available. That's what Samsia was grabbing. If you need a headset, if you find that you need a headset tonight to hear a little bit more clearly, we have those available. You can just grab one from the table with the blue tablecloth, or you can give me a little wave and I'll grab one for you. We are also encouraging folks to mask at tonight's event. So if you need a mask, we also have those at the table. Now I am delighted to welcome our speakers. Rebecca Nagle is an award-winning reporter, writer, and citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She's the creator and host of Crooked Media's chart-topping podcast, This Land. Her work has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Guardian, USA Today, Teen Vogue, The Huffington Post, among other outlets. Nagle lives in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and she's going to be talking tonight with Wudan Yan. Wudan is an award-winning narrative journalist, fact-checker, and entrepreneur based here in Seattle. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, California Sunday Magazine, High Country News, The New York Times, Popular Mechanics, and beyond. She's a multi-grantee of the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting and has also received grants from UC Berkeley, the Institute of Journalism and Natural Resources, and the International Women's Media Foundation to support her work. On top of her editorial work, Wudan has founded two companies, the Writers Co-op, a business podcast and learning academy for freelance creatives, and Factual, a fact-checking agency, which I suspect will be in high demand. Yes. So please take a minute to welcome our speakers, and we'll invite Wudan and Rebecca up to the stage.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming out on a rainy Wednesday. I had to think for a minute what day of the week it is. So I'm going to start with a reading from the book, and then we're going to get into the conversation. Does that sound great? Um, if you haven't read the book has kind of two narrative threads. One that follows a contemporary court case that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and one thread that is in history and in the past. And part of that thread is the story of my ancestors making a controversial decision that was very pivotal in Cherokee history. And so what you need to know to understand this reading is that I'm a descendant of Major Ridge and John Ridge. And at this point in history, the state of Georgia it has been harassing Cherokees to try and force them to move west. And in resistance, Cherokees challenged that harassment and actually won a Supreme Court case, Worcester v. Georgia. And Andrew Jackson has decided not to enforce that court case. Right, so we'll start there. From his education and years of diplomacy, John could see what was politically possible, arguably more than most of his fellow Cherokees. John began thinking about the previously unthinkable, signing away the land of their ancestors in exchange for land out west. It's a heartbreak many oppressed people have known, but one we don't like to talk about. The heartbreak of giving up on justice because you know it's not possible. What had changed was not John's desire for Cherokee Nation to remain in their homeland, it was his hope. In their private meeting, even Andrew Jackson sensed the emotional reversal taking place inside the Cherokee leader. In a letter to an old war buddy, Jackson called it despair. Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot would spend the next 3 years writing petitions, making speeches, holding public meetings, and advocating for their fellow citizens to support a removal treaty. Removal to them was the only option in which Cherokees as a people and a nation would survive. Did we act in such emergencies as these? They wrote in one letter. We might choose to, as these for our own private comfort, we might choose to die here and bury our bones in the land of our fathers, where white people might desecrate our tombs with the plowshare of the farmer. But when we think of our children, they pleaded, we will at all hazards seek freedom in the far regions of the West. Though unelected or appointed by the Cherokee people, the treaty party met in the home of Elias Boudinot on December 29, 1835. They signed their names to the Treaty of New Echota. Unable to read or write in English, Major Ridge signed his name with an X. He told the others, I have signed my death warrant. It is one thing to choose a death of honor. It is another to choose a death of disgrace. The Ridges forfeited their lives for the Cherokee cause, knowing they would be remembered not for their sacrifice, but for their treason. The treaty was, however, undemocratic and illegal. The Cherokee people had voted down a removal treaty through public meetings and their elected representatives multiple times. By circumventing democracy, the treaty denied Cherokees the right to think for themselves. The treaty party's justification for their illegal act was the immense suffering of the Cherokee people. But shouldn't the Cherokee people, as they argued at the time, decide best how to relieve their own suffering? And under the treaty, their suffering would get immeasurably worse. Historians still debate whether or not the United States committed genocide against indigenous peoples. The crime has never been acknowledged by our government. At the time, the term did not exist. The word genocide, coined in 1944 during the Holocaust, combines the Greek prefix henos, which means race or tribe, and the Latin suffix sede, meaning killing. In 1948, the crime was defined by the United Nations as the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group by one or more acts of physical violence. The Cherokee word for our removal is Degeja'i Lustana'i. It literally means when they drove us. It's the same word we use to talk about herding animals. To prepare, the army split logs, drove them into the ground lengthwise, and built 25 open-air stockades. The majority of Cherokee people believed the treaty was still being renegotiated and that, if successful, they would stay. Earlier that spring, they had planted their fields of corn looking towards the fall harvest. But on May 23, 1838, 7,000 US soldiers and militiamen went out into the hills and the valleys of Cherokee Nation to round them all up. Cherokees, startled by bayonets in their gardens or kitchen, were not allowed to collect any possessions for the journey. At gunpoint, the militia drove a woman in labor from a remote valley town to the main concentration camp. Even after she gave birth, they would not let her rest. Finally, on a riverbank near the stockade, she lay down and died. The army was woefully unprepared to feed and house their thousands of captives. The open-air stockades provided no shelter or sanitation. There was not even a place to use the bathroom. At night, militiamen roamed the camps, abducting and assaulting Cherokee women. By fall, Cherokees had buried 2,000 of their fellow citizens. As a newspaper reported at the time, that is 1/8 of the whole number in less than 4 months. When Cherokees marched west that winter, death followed. People walked over 1,000 miles. The footsteps of thousands left a trench in the earth. Although the exact number is unknown, one missionary estimated 4,000 people died between the camps and removal, a quarter of the total population, and people blamed the Ridges. On the morning of June 22nd, 1839, John Ridge and his family awoke to a loud noise. A group of armed men kicked in their front door. They dragged John from his bed into the front yard. Two men held John's arms while others held his body. They stabbed him 29 times. They threw John's body up into the air and stomped on his chest until it caved in. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they left. John was still alive when his wife, Sarah, was finally able to reach him. He tried to speak to her, but all that came out of his mouth was blood. Sarah sent a runner to warn Major Ridge of the danger. The runner returned with the news that he was also dead. By my grandmother, I was raised to believe that the assassinations were vengeful and wrong. As an adult, however, I do not agree. For what they did, I think the Ridges had to die. According to the very law Major Ridge helped pass, the punishment for unlawfully ceding Cherokee land was death. And unlike the Republic of the United States at the time, our much older democracy followed the law. According to an even older law, our traditional blood law, for the souls of those who died on the Trail of Tears to travel on to the next world, their deaths had to be avenged. Otherwise, their blood would forever cry out for justice. From that view, the deaths of my family members allowed the souls of thousands to rest in peace. How could that not be justified? The Ridges are still considered traitors by a majority of Cherokee people, a fate I think they accepted before they died. If what they had been trying to save was their own legacy, they would have never signed that treaty. What I believe they truly cared about, however, did come true. Cherokees as a nation and a people are still here. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that chapter, Rebecca. It hits different when you're reading it right in front of me. So Rebecca and I have worked together on two narrative nonfiction projects. I not only fact-checked this book, but I also, if you've heard the second season of This Land, I worked on that as well. One question I had when I was working on that section in particular was, I was curious when your family thought it was appropriate to tell you the stories of John and Major Ridge.
Oh,
Since you started there.
yeah.
Let's start there.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember a time it not being discussed. Like it was also just talked about, you know. So uh I remember as a kid thinking that they were like great grandparents and then growing up to realize that they were more distant ancestors, but it was sort of like, you know, there was like an Aunt Body and like a Granddaddy Poe and like people that my aunts and uncle and dad had like grown up around, but I never knew because they had died before I was born, but I always heard about them. You know, like, you know, you have those family members that people just tell stories about. And so as a kid, like that's where they existed in my mind. And then as I grew older, I realized like, oh no, this is like my great 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 grandparent. And also they were like really pivotal in history in this way that I think I didn't fully grasp. But I don't think that my family ever tried to like protect me from it or, there wasn't ever a moment where they were like, okay, we have to sit down and tell you this. It was sort of just something that was always, it just came up and was talked about.
And whether they were heroes or traitors, I mean, you share kind of how you landed in that excerpt just now, but I want to hear about, I don't know, just briefly, the evolution.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in researching the book, I read letters between the family members like Elias Cornelius Boudinot and Sarah Ridge and other children of John Ridge and Elias Boudinot and other relatives, letters between like Elias Cornelius and Stan Wadey. And the kind of narrative that I was raised with from my grandmother, the very specific story that my grandmother told me, you can see in those letters, which is that, which I don't think is true, but that John Ross ordered the assassinations, that John Ross was the bad guy, and my ancestors were the heroes. And again, it was one of those things that it wasn't until I was older that I realized that that was how my family saw it, but not how a majority of Cherokee people saw it. And I think, as an adult, and I think as a journalist, it was really important for me to be able to look at it objectively. And I hope that people don't think that the book is some sort of effort to sort of redeem their legacy or retell this story. But I think we actually have a lot to learn from their story. And I think that our ancestors were facing this unrelenting policy of ethnic cleansing, and everything that they were trying to do, winning a Supreme Court decision, all of these things didn't matter because the South and the Jackson administration were hell bent on getting rid of Cherokee people. And I think that lots of tribes had the same kind of have that same kind of crossroads in their history, where the question is, do we make compromises based on what we think is our best way to survive, or do we stand up and fight for justice and what we think is right? And then also people's perspective of how do we best survive the situation is different. And I think a lot of tribes have that history of different factions trying different things. And I think what we can learn from the Ridges, because I think the shorthand version of the story that I think is being told less, but I think you would hear from a lot of people like 10 and 20 years ago, is that they were corrupt, that they took a bribe, that they were sellouts. And I think the truth of it is just much sadder than that, was that they literally thought that Cherokee people wouldn't survive unless we moved, and they tried everything that they could do to convince the tribe that that was the best solution. And then eventually they decided to just go behind everyone's back, knowing what would happen to them for that. And I don't think that that's the right, I believe in democracy and self-determination. And I think whether it was right or wrong, it was the decision of the Cherokee people at that time, whether we should move or stay. But I think it's almost like I think that they made the wrong decision for the right reason. And I think understanding the position that they were in, I think we can better understand what US policy did to Indigenous peoples at that time, and the unimaginable decisions that our ancestors had to make, not from a place of fighting for justice, but from a place of fighting for survival.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And hearing how that reporting and research builds empathy in a way, right? So you already mentioned that the book is a braided narrative. There's a lot more to this really rich history that catches up to the present day. But what is the other part of the narrative?
Yeah, so the spine of the book is about a 2020 Supreme Court case. Okay, I'm back. So the spine of the book is about a 2020 Supreme Court case that resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. And that case was called McGirt v. Oklahoma. And it was fought over the question of whether or not Muskogee Nation still had a reservation. And the case started in a surprising place. So in 1999, a citizen of Muskogee Nation named Patrick Murphy murdered another Muskogee citizen named George Jacobs. And it was a pretty brutal murder. And Patrick was sentenced to death by the state of Oklahoma. Fast forward a few years, his case lands in the office of the federal public defender in Oklahoma City. And she starts looking into the case, and she comes up with this argument with the help of some other lawyers that, hey, wait a minute, actually, Oklahoma doesn't have jurisdiction to execute this person, let alone prosecute him in the first place, because this crime actually happened on a reservation. Now, that reservation hadn't been acknowledged since Oklahoma became a state. So it hadn't been acknowledged, it hadn't been recognized by the state or by the federal government in over 100 years. And so that question of whether or not Muskogee Nation still had a reservation is what eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the book kind of traces that 20-year journey from the original crime through the death penalty appeals, and then when it becomes a case not about a death penalty, a man on death row, but about the reservation status of a tribe.
So that leads to my next question, which is about how you open the book, not about spitting on Andrew Jackson's grave, but with the true crime story of this murder. And you and I both work in audio, and well know that true crime is becoming a bit trite, but effective in getting people to listen. So how did you think about incorporating kind of that theme and that way of storytelling into this book specifically?
Yeah, that was something I kind of honestly struggled with because I didn't want the retelling of the murder to feel gratuitous or to feel exploitative. And at the same time, I didn't want the legal victory that resulted to paper over the community and the family tragedies that led up to that victory. And I wanted the book to hold that tension. And so I hope that I struck that balance, because I think that while for a lot of tribal citizens living in Oklahoma, McGirt represented this sort of rare victory and this rare moment of justice, for the family members of George Jacobs who thought that, their family's murderer had been tried and convicted and sentenced, it reopened all of this old trauma. And I think too, one of the functions that I wanted, I hope that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people are still talking about the McGirt case as, this really important case for treaty rights and for land rights in the US. I hope that it has that long legacy. And I wanted to document how the case happened. How did we get here? Because it wasn't a bunch of lawyers sitting in a room saying, okay, how are we going to get the state to recognize the reservations we know are here in eastern Oklahoma? It was a lot of happenstance. And that's actually kind of not abnormal for federal Indian law. A lot of our really important cases start with a crime, going all the way back to Crow Dog, and so that's how a lot of these jurisdictional issues on tribal land get settled. And so I think I also just wanted, that there is this original heinous crime, and then there are these public defenders and a man on death row, and then there's, the young native kid in law school who finds out about the case and believes in it and gets, a law firm with expertise involved, and all of these things that had to fall into place for us to get to where we are. So that was part of the motivation of going so deep into the backstory was I wanted this, historical case for the history of this historical case to be well documented.
Absolutely. So, want to actually have a brief educational interlude and talk about this concept of tribal sovereignty. I imagine many of us in this room have heard those two words together in the same sentence, but Rebecca, I would like for you to help elucidate what it is, what tribes get, what they're able to do with it, and why white settlers, legislators, politicians, the Supreme Court seem to feel so threatened by this concept.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a good starting point for sovereignty is that it's inherent. And so tribes have existed since before the United States existed, since before the US was even a concept. And our right to our land, to self-governance, to our lifeways is inherent and is there whether or not the colonizing government recognizes it. Now, what sovereignty we are able to exercise is, of course, deeply impacted by colonization. But what's I think is really important, and one of the points that I make in the book is that, our ancestors by, lobbying Congress, by bringing, court cases that go back to the early 1800s, by fighting wars, like by fighting wars where the US had to make treaties with big concessions in it, created a foothold in American democracy that's where our inherent sovereignty is legally recognized, in the Constitution, through our treaties, and through federal Indian law. And federal Indian law, one of the people I interviewed for the book is this amazing legal scholar named Maggie Blackhawk. And I don't know if you guys know, but Supreme Court Justice Thomas has this quote where he calls, and it's kind of ableist, so I apologize for that, but he calls federal Indian law schizophrenic because there are a lot of contradictions within it. And when I interviewed Maggie Blackhawk, she had this great quote where she said, no, it's not that, it's a battlefield. And it's the wins and it's the losses and it's the compromises. And that's why there are all of these contradictions in it. And so I think when we look at federal Indian law, it's not enough, right? It's not enough. And at the same time, we have to constantly fight for it to be upheld and followed. Because part of the way that colonization works is that the law sometimes doesn't apply to the colonizer, right? It's sort of like the U.S. That's kind of the cruel irony, is that the U.S. created this entire legal framework with which to seize indigenous land and then doesn't even follow its own rules. And so I think that that's part of the legacy that we're left with today as contemporary Native people, where we have our inherent sovereignty. It's recognized in U.S. law, but what we have under U.S. law is, of course, still not enough.
And all that context is why the McGirt ruling was so historic, which, as you said, resulted in the largest restoration of native land. But almost immediately on the heels of it, Oklahoma started throwing a tantrum. Why were they behaving like a three-nager?
Yeah. So Oklahoma, like a lot of states, you guys probably have experienced that in Washington too, don't like it when tribes have more power. And so the backlash on the ground in Oklahoma to the McGirt decision, unfortunately, was almost immediate. And so at first, the state floated this idea of, because what the Supreme Court did in its ruling is that it looked at the laws Congress had passed and saw that Congress hadn't passed a law that got rid of the Muskogee Reservation. And that's what's required for a court to come around and say this reservation no longer exists. Congress has to get rid of it. But Congress still has that power. And so Oklahoma's hope was, well, the Supreme Court said Congress hadn't gotten rid of the reservation, but that doesn't mean that Congress couldn't. But Oklahoma quickly realized it didn't have the political power to get that done. And so it went back to the court, and it actually took this very drastic measure of asking the Supreme Court to overturn a ruling that was not even 2 years old. And it asked the Supreme Court to do that 50 times. And which is wild, right? Really wild, over 50 times. And the justification, which I think is really important for us to talk about, because I think this justification is used to undermine tribal sovereignty all the time. The justification that Oklahoma used was lawlessness. They said that, crimes are going unprosecuted, people are, the McGirt decision, they called it a get out of jail free card. And I think we're going to get into this, but a lot of what they claimed was not true. Ended up being really, really not true.
It wasn't true. I fact checked that part. Yes. So Governor Stitt basically was saying, the Oklahoma governor at the time said that potentially 76,000 cases could be overturned. And you made a point of this in your book, and as consumers of media here, how the media covered the backlash to McGirt by just repeating Stitt's unbased claim I guess my question here is really like, as consumers of media, how can we like remain skeptical when reading pieces that cover Native nations, tribal sovereignty, these sorts of court cases, to really, assess whether or not that news article is doing a good job of laying out what's going on?
Yeah, I mean that's one thing that I'm really passionate about because I think that the news industry is extremely racist towards indigenous communities, and that we just get a level of journalism that's just really subpar. And I think it's what I think non-native outlets are continually doing aren't meeting the standards of journalism. So there's a lot of inaccuracy. A lot of times there's a lot of stereotypes. When they're reporting on our communities, usually it's late, it's not timely. And so, I think even this past week, there was one of the big national exit polls showed that 65% of Native people voted for Trump. This was widely reported because it's the exit poll that like NBC and a bunch of other places used. And so a really amazing sociologist named Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, who's Tulalip, she and her team went and looked into the methodology, and it turns out that 65% was based on the respondents of like 200 Native people, none of whom were on tribal land. None of the polling places that they took exit polls were on tribal land. And so I think you see that. I mean, and it's not just, sadly, it's not just the McGirt backlash. I think we saw really bad reporting when it came to Brackeen and the attack on ICWA. I mean, even like with COVID in the early months of the pandemic, I did a story on how like half of the states who were reporting racial disparity data on COVID at that point weren't collecting data for Native people. And so I think that the I wish I could give a guidepost. I mean, I think the best way is to just follow Native media. So, like ICT News, Native News Online, Indian Collective, Indians with a Z.com. Tribal newspapers are a great source, especially to lift up Muskogee Media, which is the tribal newspaper for Muskogee Nation. They've been doing a ton of work for freedom of the press. So they're a really good example of that. And so I think the best way to avoid that kind of misinformation, because it's sort of not like, oh, avoid, the sketchy online site. It's like, from really trusted sources you should be able to trust, like the Washington Post or the New York Times are making this mistake. So I think really trying to go to Native folks to understand those things. And when Native people are pointing out the mistake, like Native News Online publish something about the wrong exit poll, help amplify that stuff. Because sometimes we're just saying it in an exit, like in a little echo chamber, and it can be really frustrating.
Okay. I know you might have questions. Ask a fact checker. Switching the programming very briefly.
Yeah. So, like Wudan mentioned, she fact checked the book. She's an amazing fact checker. I'll tell you like two fact checking stories. So, there was like one passage where I had written that somebody looked out their front picture window, and Wudan put a link to the definition of what a picture window is and said, do you have evidence that this is a picture window, which is different than just a window? It's not just a large window, it can't have any panes. Do you have evidence that this window had no little like divider thingies? And I was like, no, I guess the word picture's gotta go. So, which is a writer, you make stupid mistakes when especially when you do a ton of research and you're synthesizing a lot of stuff, you just make mistakes. And so it's really, really, for me, invaluable to have that level of fact checking so that I know that it's not just, me going back through something that I may have even misremembered. So one thing I wanted to ask you, so there was the historical part of the book and then the contemporary part. Was there a difference for you in fact checking the two time periods that the book spanned?
Yeah. So, in terms of the source material, it was wildly different. For all the contemporary material, I'm very used to reading over lots and lots of court documents, understanding what is said, and the subtext, because people talk the way that they do now mostly. And then for the historical documents, so a lot of the files were like scanned in a very particular way or copied in a particular way. And the text looked distorted to me. Of course, I don't have perfect vision, but I would have to like take breaks, like reading the pages and looking for the paragraph or the few sentences to verify a specific fact, because I just started, like, all the words just started bleeding together. So that, I mean, logistically, it was definitely a challenge. But also, I think there's a lot more resources to corroborate contemporary what's going on today. Whereas historically, I'm not a historian. So fact checkers, I don't know if y'all know this, often are not experts in anything. We're an expert in testing every fact that is presented to us as a hypothesis in a rigorous fashion by looking at the sourcing that is provided. Who's telling us this? Could they possibly be wrong? And if that is true, or wrong, or have a vested interest in telling me this, and if that is the case, I have to go look for an independent, different source. And so for contemporary stuff, there's google.com. For historical stuff, not necessarily, but you worked with an amazing historian who was able to be on backup and help me like work through some of the material. So yeah, two very different experiences.
And I was wondering too if there are certain things you do to take care of yourself while you're fact checking stuff that's really heavy. There was one time where with the one of the things that happened during Muskogee Nation's removal is that towards the end of their forced march, there was a lot of winter weather and there was a lot of snow, and the contractors that the government had hired to remove them had told them not to weigh down the wagons with their winter clothing, and had actually been like, we'll ship it. And then they lost the shipment in the Gulf of Mexico. And so people were walking through the snow literally with bare feet. And one of the factual claims was like how many inches of snow it was. And I remember like the source I had cited didn't have that it was 8 inches. And I remember there was this day where I was like, my soul can't take this, where I was like, okay, I have to go back through all my primary sources that describe this horrific scene and find the one that says 8 inches of snow. And it was just like, and so I was wondering, how do you as a fact checker, when you're fact checking stuff that's heavy, and I know the second season of the podcast had that too, what do you do to take care of yourself?
I don't know if I have a good answer to that. Well, for this book in particular, naively, I didn't really know what I was going to get. The way that I handle my fact checking projects, because I deal with many of them on an annual basis, is think of it as the next episode of a bingeable TV series. Okay, and so when it comes into my inbox, I just like dive in head first. So you were sending me odd chapters first, the contemporary chapters about the McGirt case, and the second chapter that you sent was about Patrick Murphy's conditions in like, I'm gonna fudge the facts, solitary confinement basically, and how and what it was like being a prisoner on death row. And I kind of, I don't know, there must have been bad stuff happening in the news that week too, that kind of just like compounded on everything. And I emailed you, I was like, I need a trigger warning, just let me know. Because that really just helps prime my brain and kind of, like make sure I have the emotional capacity in a given workday to handle that kind of material. So yeah, that kind of pacing. And in the same way that some podcasts have a trigger warning or shows and so on and so forth, I think is generally helpful for me to prime my mental state when it comes to checking.
And that was really helpful for me because I like there's a trigger warning in the book, but I hadn't thought about, like all the people who I'm like collaborating with. And so that was something we worked out in our process, was to and be like, here's all the horrible things that happen in this chapter. So
Yeah, and I will say the violence in the book didn't feel gratuitous. I felt like it served a purpose. But that's not, so I'm gonna ask one more question of you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So in preparation for this talk, I listened to your audiobook on 2x speed like a crazy person. But when I got to the chapter detailing indigenous resistance to the second Jackson regime, oh, and by the way, I did it last weekend, so after the election. Listening to the chapter about indigenous resistance under the second Jackson presidency, I was like, the whole meaning of this book kind of shifted for me. And right now, there's this kind of like idea that basically everyone who's not a wealthy corporation or a billionaire is oppressed in our political system. And so, you know, Trump has praised Andrew Jackson. And I guess my question here is, based on indigenous history and this knowledge that you've garnered from researching the book, what can we take from resistance under Jackson and kind of like be a nugget for us to think about as we enter the next thing?
Yeah, no, I think
No pressure.
no, I think that there are actually a lot of parallels. So Jackson won the White House in 1828, and it wasn't the first time he had run for president. So he had run in 1824, and the election was ultimately settled by the House, and John Quincy Adams won, um, as decided by the House. And Jackson claimed that the election was stolen, and he really campaigned in 1828 on this idea of Washington elites deciding for the people and that the election was stolen. And he won in a landslide. And he's often considered the first populist president in the United States. And his signature policy was the ethnic cleansing of indigenous people from what was then the territorial limits of the United States. You know, you can read his State of the Union addresses, and this is like the thing that he basically tasks Congress with doing. I think the other thing that's not known about this period is how much opposition there was to Jackson and how much opposition there was to removal. I think we don't learn about this protest movement in US history, but the largest petition drive in the country's history was mounted. People in the North, particularly white Christians, because they had been sort of they had been establishing missions, particularly in Cherokee Nation. They had relationships with the tribes, were really opposed to removal. Women organized the first public political action ever in the United States to oppose removal. Um, and and then of course, you know, there was a constitutional crisis. You know, the Supreme Court told Georgia that it had to stop harassing Cherokees, and then Jackson just openly defied it. um and I think, I don't know if I have words of hope. But I mean, part of what happened when you really drill down into the specifics is that people thought about pushing back harder on Jackson defying the Supreme Court, but were worried that it would tear the Union apart. And so even the missionaries who had filed the lawsuit accepted this pardon from the state of Georgia and dropped it, instead of trying to keep it going. And so in a way, indigenous people were sacrificed to kind of keep the country together. And to me, that would be the lesson that we can think about in this time, because what resulted was that 80,000 indigenous people were forcibly removed. And we don't have full numbers, but for a lot of tribes, a third to a quarter of their population died during that removal. And I think that I think that those sins are still a part of our government, and we're still seeing the manifestations of that today.
All right. That's, yeah, not hopeful, but I think just organizing, right? I think that's probably the best, thinking about ways we can do that as a community.
Yeah.
generally constructive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that I think resistance and allyship has been a part of our history, I think sometimes more than we are taught.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. If folks have questions,
If you have questions, I have one here.
Oh, OCO, Wado, for coming. I'm Steve Hampton and a huge fan. Thank you for your book. And so my question is, I'm thinking about your second podcast where you investigated the right-wing law firms and think tanks that were attacking the Indian Child Welfare Act, ultimately unsuccessfully, but they had ulterior motives. What specific policy concerns are you thinking about for the next 4 years? And like with respect to Indian country, maybe Cherokee Nation specifically, or other native nations as well?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, one of the things that's in Project 2025 is ending federal contracts with tribes, which is scary because I know for Cherokee Nation, but for a lot of tribes, that's can be a big source of revenue. And so some of the quote unquote preferences we get in federal contracting. Um, I think also there has been talk around like drilling and more drilling on tribal lands. I think what was really scary that I saw in the Brackeen case was what I would have called a movement towards neo-termination of this idea, and they were using the courts to do it. I mean, the Supreme Court told them to go home in Brackeen, and said, in a 7-2, get out of here. And I haven't seen it that effort recoalesce with some of the heavy players that I think would need to be part of it for it to be successful. Goldwater is still bringing cases, and I think that they'll continue. But if you look at where their cases went, they didn't ever really get very far. It was kind of when they also had the added layer of the corporate lawyers that they were able to bring a case that was successful. So yeah, but I think, I don't know. I think that tribes have enough Republicans in Congress that I don't think, even with like the House and the Senate being Republican, that you would have a House and a Senate that would pass sweeping legislation. But maybe that's naive. But we've got Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma and Tom Cole. But I mean, even Republicans like Tom Cole, I mean, he takes his colleagues aside and is like, let me explain tribal sovereignty to you and like why you need to pass VAWA or why tribes need to be included in this bill. And so, I mean, and then you have people like Lisa Murkowski. And so I think there is like bipartisan support for tribes, but we'll see. I mean, I think we're in a new, I think that what a lot of what was true about how politics operated 5 or 10 years ago is quickly shifting. And so maybe that's something that will change too.
There was a question in the middle. We have a mic heading your way.
Hey, I'm a huge fan of your work and blown away by it all the time. How much is your investigative work used in these cases that are brought against or brought up for ending tribal sovereignty in ICWA?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, so when you get to the Supreme Court, like how that works is a little tricky, but the reporting for the second season of ICWA was cited in briefs. But I think what was even more powerful is that a few of the people that we interviewed heavily for the podcast actually submitted their own briefs. And I think through the podcast, lawyers identified those people and said, oh, a brief from this person would be really powerful. And I think one of the most powerful briefs was from Robin Bradshaw, who was a grandmother who had fought some white foster parents for custody of her grandchild. And so she submitted a brief. And one of the really important things was that they were trying to use that case to establish standing, which they didn't have, and the adoption had been finalized, and so they didn't have standing, and so that was something that was really important that her brief spoke to. And if you see on the equal protection thing, they lost on standing. So I think obviously, I think Robin and her bravery and putting her name forward and doing that work deserves more credit than the podcast. But circuitously, we gave it a little bump.
Your reporting on the Oklahoma numbers also got a mention during arguments.
Yeah, yeah. So Allison Herrera and I co-reported an article that appeared in the Atlantic before the oral arguments in Castro Huerta. And Sonia Sotomayor referenced that in oral arguments, and then it was also referenced in Gorsuch's dissent. So that was kind of cool, but we still lost, so ended up not mattering.
Other questions? Got one up here. I'll come to you. You're still thinking? Okay. Hello, Nicole Aranda, former neighbor of yours, Baltimore. I have a comment and a question. My comment is, I'm so proud of you. It's true. We were neighbors in 2016.
Yeah.
And I knew you first as an artist and a community organizer, and the way you have blossomed and grown these past 8 years has been such an inspiration, and I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, it's so nice to
Glad
see
to
you.
see you. My question, and it's funny that you asked about how she takes care of herself. How have you been taking care of yourself?
Oh, can you restate
Oh,
that?
yep. How have you been taking care of yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I've been really sick the past year. I got long COVID, if folks don't know. So I like the mask situation. Um, yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to let myself slow down, which is hard for me. But letting myself slow down and putting less pressure on myself right now is what I'm focusing on.
One here. You're still thinking? Okay.
Mine is a comment. I'm Mary Price Baudet and a citizen of Cherokee Nation. There's a whole bunch of us here representing, well, we're called the Cherokee community of Puget Sound. We're one of the at-large groups. I want to thank you for digging deep into the history that is not written anywhere and going through all those books and missionaries, ledgers and census reports. I mean, it's boggling my mind. And when you speak in your podcast, I understand. When I read a legal document, I can't understand what the lawyers are saying. Thank you so much for what you're doing, for bringing the history back.
Oh, thank you. We can just turn tonight into like a Rebecca Love Fest. That's fine. Nobody has to ask another question. No, but on a serious note, I mean that means a lot to me because and actually kind of goes back to my time as a community organizer in Baltimore because what I learned as a community organizer is how much policy and law has a profound impact on people's lives, but how those systems are purposely obscure. And so a lot of the work that I did as an organizer was like at a community meeting, be like, okay, like this is what a consent decree is. And like, this is what the consent decree can do, but this is what the consent decree can't do because Maryland has these laws that protect police from these types of modes of accountability. And we'd have to like break things down for people. And it was extremely complicated in a way that was hard for normal people to understand. And I started to think that that was on purpose. And I think that it's kind of anti-democratic. Like, I think that the people whose lives laws impact should understand what those laws are and what they do. And so that's something I'm really passionate about, is sort of trying to take all that legal stuff, because I'm not a lawyer either, and make it understandable, but without watering it down. Because I think that's really important in a democracy. And I think especially for federal Indian law, I think as tribal citizens, there's a way that the law, I feel like, has like an outsized impact on our lives. You know, it's like we're coming up against the law in ways that I think are at least different and unique, if not more, than other populations in the United States. And so I think it's just really important that, you know, our tribal citizens understand what these laws are that impact us.
Okay. Just talking to it. Okay, hi, my name is Marissa Perez. I am a member of the Guala Sioux Nation from Pine Ridge, and I live here in Seattle. I'm actually hopefully going to start legal school, law school. I'm a little starstruck, sorry. In the next few months in August. And so I'm specifically because I believe that tribes are about to be in for the fight of their lives. And I want to be a part of that fight. And so I wanted to ask, you had kind of touched on it a little bit about the bipartisanship and the support for tribes from a bipartisanship perspective. But we know that, you know, in Project 2025, there's some pretty scary stuff about tribes and about the Department of the Interior. And so I wanted to know, you talked earlier about the battlefield, about Indian law being a push and a pull and a win and a loss. And we've seen that over the past few years with several high-profile wins and some equally devastating losses. And so I wanted to know what your thoughts were about where the next battles are going to be fought. Are they going to continue to be with ICWA, with EO? Are they going to, or with equal opportunity? The playbook that they essentially wrote in Brackeen, is it going to be mineral rights? Is it going to be drilling? Like, what can we look forward to? Where do we need to start aiming at, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I do think that I think it'll be interesting because they've been trying to use, and one of the cases was here in Washington, one of the gaming cases, this idea of equal protection to kind of go at tribes. So for people who don't know, you know, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment says that laws can't treat people differently based on race, and if they are based on race, they go through this thing called strict scrutiny, da 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 da. And we have a Supreme Court that loves to strike down things like affirmative action based on equal protection. But tribes are completely separate from that, because as tribal citizens, that's a political classification. It's not a racial classification. And it goes back to that treaty relationship. But the right has been trying to lump tribes in with other minorities in sort of this equal protection attack. And so far, they have been unsuccessful. And I think it'll take some time. And like I said before, Goldwater is still trying to use ICWA. There are these few like casino cases. I'm sure there's a bunch of cases. I know there are also cases where defendants are trying to use the equal protection argument on both sides, like Native defendants saying like I shouldn't be tried like this, and the non-Native, like some non-Native defendants in Oklahoma are like, it's not fair that the state can prosecute me but not Native people. Um, right? I know, it's like, okay, man. Yeah. Anyways, but and so I think it'll take some time. I feel like I don't think ICWA is the next terrain, but maybe I'm naive. But the way that the Supreme Court kicked them out on standing, it they can't find standing because adoption cases don't go that long. Adoption cases don't last the 5 to 10 years it takes to get a case to the Supreme Court. Most of them are closed by then. So I don't think it'll be ICWA, but maybe that's naive. But I kind of think that one of the next big battlegrounds is going to be water rights. I really think that water is going to be one of the next big legal issues. Um, and so I think specifically like in the Southwest with the Colorado River, I think that that's going to be a big thing coming down the pike. And I think if the worst impulses come out, I think too the other metaphor I've heard is like a pendulum swing where we sort of like, so we had the termination era, and then after that we had the self-determination era, and maybe we're in a swing back to something like termination. I don't know. I think we'll have to let it play out. Well, not let it play out, fight. Sorry, that was like a really defeatist way to say it. I don't mean to say it like that, but I think it's like I think I'll be interested to see, because also like Trump's transition team talked about basically getting rid of tribes and getting rid of reservations at the beginning of the first term. Like I looked at with Reagan, our former chief swimmer was on that team, and they put forward like a white paper that was like, it's always very coded, right? But like if you read between the lines, it's like, let's get rid of tribes and tribal land, and it didn't happen, and I don't think it was ever a priority, and so we'll just have to see. Yeah, we'll have to see.
I want to take a minute to acknowledge all the folks that are watching online, and we have a couple comments and a question. So let's see. David says, shout out to Cherokee Community Club of Puget Sound. Woo woo. And Lynette says, could you thank Rebecca for those of us on Zoom for all she's doing? Thanks so much, Wado. And then Bob asks, do you have any future books or podcasts in progress?
Oh, I'm working on an essay series that's a collaboration with some Native scholars. One of them is Maggie Blackhawk, and also Ned Blackhawk, Phil Deloria, Nick Estes. So I feel very cool that I get to hang out with them in an intellectual way because they're all very smart. And the essay series, we're looking for a home for it, so it's sort of in its concept phase, but it would be about how both how colonization and genocide has shaped U.S. law and the U.S. government in ways that are unrecognized, and but also how indigenous resistance has shaped the United States and is foundational, and how even just like the way that white America borrows from Native culture is sort of part of quintessential American identity in a way that we don't talk about. And so it'll be kind of a collection of essays that speaks to that. And then the next book I want to write, which I haven't even started yet and probably won't start for some time, but I really want to write more about allotment. So there's a chunk of this book, there's 3 chapters that are about allotment. But I feel like there was a level of criminality and theft and violence that was perpetrated on the allottees of the 5 tribes that I don't think has been well documented, and I think we're just starting to talk about. So I think we have like certain stories that we talk about, but I think we haven't put together the whole of it yet. And so that's something that I'd really like to research and write about. And I think we're kind of prime, like we're starting to talk about the Osage murders and even the Tulsa race massacre that wasn't really talked about in Oklahoma that much even like 10 or 20 years ago has more awareness now. And so I think that, and this is about 20, phone off again. This is about 20 years before that. And I think it is part of that story of the extremely violent birth of Oklahoma.
We have a question here. Yes, still?
People. Okay, good. Sorry, it's a little weird. So I'm Drew. I am actually a lawyer, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you feel, but I do practice Indian law, and I actually started off my career as a child welfare attorney, so I loved your second season of Brackeen. It is extremely important to me and an important topic. And, you know, I look at the Brackeen decision. I like to try to, when I teach this to folks, I say, there's a win, but within the win, there's always a loss. And in Brackeen's loss, the 2 major warning lights for me are the Thomas decision about narrowing Congress's ability to govern the affairs of tribal peoples. And as Marissa correctly pointed out, the concurrence, and for those who can't see it, I'm putting in air quotes because even though Kavanaugh agrees with the decision, he gives the roadmap to somebody, anybody in his mind, that will give the equal protection claim. And as an Indian lawyer, as somebody who practices in this area, I always get nervous because, yes, we have these long-standing principles, like the fact that membership is not race-based. It's based off of social political connection, but that might change tomorrow. And the thing I struggle with is the ability to communicate that outside of the circle, outside of the people who live with this day to day. And I love your podcast because you broke down these issues so well. And I would love to know any particular pieces of advice as a communicator of these really deep, difficult, complex issues. How can we, those of us who are in the know, who understand these issues, be better communicators on a day-to-day basis to the greater community so we can have better advocacy to fight, to organize around these issues?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I personally, I believe that ignorance is one of the biggest barriers towards better law and policy for Indigenous people in this country. And so, I mean, you can just, there are some choice quotes I include in the book from some of our Supreme Court justices, but, during the oral arguments for Cheryl, Sandra Day O'Connor asked that if the Oneida tribe's treaty rights were upheld, would all the white people who lived on their land be evicted? Justice, Supreme Chief Justice, um, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, during the baby girl oral arguments, asked this whole series of questions betraying he didn't really know how tribal citizenship worked, including a question about whether or not people who feel that they're Cherokee can be a citizen of a federally recognized tribe. um, in that same case, Briers, who's liberal, asked if ICWA would allow Native men to rape non-Native women and keep the baby. And recently in Brackeen, Alito made a comment that about this political identity, that tribes don't share a common political interest because before Europeans came, we were all at war with each other. And so, and you can see the racism too in the types of arguments that our opponents make in front of the Supreme Court, like the reservations are lawless, like that argument only works without evidence in a world where people are going to assume that about reservations, right? Where they're already primed to make those assumptions. And so I do really think, to your point about how do we educate people, which I'm not answering, but what I was going to, but to lay the groundwork is that I think that ignorance is the biggest barrier. And I think it's going to take a really long time to fix because I think it's systemic. It's not just the courts, it's education, it's pop culture, it's news media. And Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, who I mentioned before, has done a bunch of research where she shows that the erasure of Native people from just sort of like what people are seeing creates this really stubborn stereotype in people's minds that we're less real and we're less human. I think a really big portion of the population of our country doesn't know that we still exist, and so we're just, and so I think that but I think that all the ways that we fight back against that erasure is good and is valid, and this is a very big picture thing. But I think that Standing Rock was a generational shift. And I mean, in my lifetime, I remember it being the first time that that was back when everybody was on Facebook still. But it was the first time that my non-native friends and my native friends were posting about the same thing, ever. And I think that it was this moment where literally a lot of non-native people were like, oh, there are still native people and they're still having to fight for stuff. I didn't know that. And I think that what we've seen, I think Hollywood is much further along than like news organizations and some other places. But I think we're starting to see those shifts. But I think it's one of those things again where it's like we're so far away from where we need to get. But yeah, and I think the other thing that has been really helpful in terms of the law is the Tribal Supreme Court project that NARF and NCAI run. And so they do, because one of the things that was really hurting tribes was that the lawyers that we would hire to go fight our cases in front of the Supreme Court were also extremely ignorant, because you have to hire somebody who has that kind of expertise and that kind of elitism, but they don't know crap about federal Indian law. And so they're training up, people like Ian Gershengorn and Riaz Kanji to be able to fight those cases. So I think it's like all of those things are helpful. And I don't think that there's one silver bullet, because I think that the problem of ignorance is so widespread and so ingrained and systemic that I think it's going to take a long time to undo that. But I think everything from Standing Rock to Native people being more visible to reservation dogs, I think all of it helps.
I think we are well past time, but in terms of educating us about the history of tribes, Rebecca, thank you. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you both. Let's give our speakers a round of applause.